to extend our heartfelt welcome to Mr. Mani Shankar Aiyar on our interview for VIT Today. Mr. Mani Shankar Aiyar is an Indian politician and has previously served as the Minister of Panchayat Raj and Development of the Northeastern region. He has also served in the Indian Foreign Service as an ambassador and the Joint Secretary of the Ministry of External Affairs.
I never made it to ambassador. I served as the Consul General in Karachi, and I took premature retirement about 10 years before my normal retirement was due. So I'm not.
Thank you so much for the clarification, sir. Yeah, and he's also a very well-known author of multiple books. So we welcome you on our interview. And my name is Abhishek Sutke. I'm a student of VIT Vellore.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, sir. Sir, can I start the interview?
Yes, yes.
All right. So I believe that you were a senior to our former Prime Minister, Shri Rajiv Gandhi, at the Trinity Hall in Cambridge. So we would like to start by talking about...
I'm afraid I have to do a fact check there. I was 3 years senior to him at school. That is the Doon School in Dehradun. And subsequently, he came to Trinity College, which is the top man's college, it's the rich man's college. It's where people like Prince Charles went. I was at humble Trinity Hall, which is a kind of hut next to this great Trinity College of Newton and Amartya Sen. So don't mix the two up. Yes, I was 3 years senior to Rajiv at school, and I was a couple of years senior to him at Cambridge, but we didn't really know each other.
All right, sir. So primarily my question was, when you met him in school and in college, did you see him becoming the Prime Minister of India and the kind of Prime Minister of India that he was, that he became years later?
Well, my only memory of him at school, and don't forget that school is 5 years, and if somebody is 3 years younger than you, then you're far too old for him, and he's far too young for you. But anyway, I do have one single memory of Rajiv. It was in my last term at school, where the school rules were that if you had passed or if you'd done your senior Cambridge exam, then you could swim at any time you wanted in the swimming pool. But if you hadn't, and it wasn't the designated hours for junior boys, then the junior boy had to take permission from the senior. So I was in the changing room at the swimming pool when this very shy boy walked up to me and said, "Yaar, hello, yaar, can you please let me swim, yaar?" The usual senior's reaction was to tell him to bugger off. But thank God I didn't. I gave him permission to do so. And that is perhaps why he took me onto his staff. And I never on his staff called him anything but sir. So in that sense, he took his revenge for having had to say yar yar again to me to beg me to let him go into the swimming pool. And my one memory of Rajiv at Cambridge, I don't really remember, and I'll tell you why in a minute. I stood for President of the Union, and I learned about 17 years later from a friend of his who was at Cambridge that when I was standing for president, Rajiv had gone among the Indian students and said, "There's an Indian standing for president. The least you guys can do is to go to the union and vote for him." So Rajiv began his political life canvassing for me. And so I think it's only appropriate, I'm ending my political life canvassing for him.
Question. Do you see Rahul Gandhi filling his father's shoes of being a prominent youth leader?
Well, Rajiv put on his shoes only when he became Prime Minister. And Rahul has never even been a minister, let alone a Prime Minister. And when he did become president, I was thrown out of the party within 2 days of his becoming president. And I've never met him since, although he's made many promises to me that he will meet me. So I'm not really in a position to evaluate whether he's fitting into Rajiv's shoes or not. All I can say is he's still not worn the prime minister's shoes. And the only Rajiv Gandhi I knew was Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. So I'm really not in a position to answer your question. But it does seem to me that there is still a long way to go. And Rajiv, of course, had no experience at all when he became the prime minister, and he just grew into the job. And perhaps that will happen when Rahul becomes prime minister, if as president of the party, he is able to lead the party to victory at the polls. Otherwise, his political life is going to in some ways be the diametric opposite of his father's. His father's was as prime minister, and his is really as a backbencher, except for a period of 1.5 years.
Right, sir. And on another note, like in 2013, when you headed the expert committee on leveraging Panchayat Raj institutions, it was considered a very important issue, especially with respect to Manrega, like the scheme as a whole. 7 years later, nobody's talking about it. What are the implications of this, in your opinion?
It is that the government certainly has no interest in taking forward the Rajiv Gandhi legacy. Indeed, as soon as Mr. Modi became the Prime Minister, the Chief Minister of Gujarat, he was perhaps the only Chief Minister of India to deny me permission as the Minister of Panchayati Raj to visit his state. And this was notwithstanding very, very earnest invitations to come and see for myself that I had received from Bhupendra Chudasama, who was his Minister of Panchayat Raj in the state of Gujarat. So it was clear to me that ideologically, the man positions himself against anything that would smack of the Congress legacy. Now, he's obliged, because it's in the Constitution, to follow the mandatory requirements of the Constitution, which is things like reservations, a 3-tier system, and so forth. But he runs the rest on his own. And as far as I'm able to gather, particularly in a similar webinar that took place almost exactly a month ago at the instance of KILA, which is the Kerala Institute of Local Administration, and the Gulati School, which is in Trivandrum, the expert on Gujarat's Panchayati Raj more or less indicated that there is no Panchayati Raj in Gujarat, and that the Panchayat institutions are simply playing no role in tackling the COVID disaster. And although Tamil Nadu and Delhi in infections have surged far forward to Gujarat, in terms of Ahmedabad and its similar cities, there's simply no doubt that Ahmedabad has by far the highest rate of infections. And this is partly because Modi invited Trump to Ahmedabad after both of them knew that the WHO had raised the level of the epidemic. They hadn't yet used the word pandemic, but they raised the level of the epidemic, as they called it, to the level of a global epidemic, which in WHO vocabulary is the highest level to which they can technically take it. Colloquially, they called it a pandemic on the 11th of March, but on the 24th of February, both in India and in the US, the first cases of COVID were known, And yet, lakhs and lakhs of people were gathered on the way from the airport to the Sardar Patel Stadium. And the Sardar Patel Stadium was packed with about 1.25 lakh people who had absolutely no social distancing and no masks. And outside, there were apparently about 75,000 people who couldn't get in, who were also gathering in close proximity to each other. So I think this was the equivalent of the Tablighi Jamaat Markaz, Modi's Markaz in Ahmedabad, and subsequently the handling of the disease has been so inadequate in Ahmedabad that compared to Jaipur or Patna or Calcutta, no, Calcutta is not comparable because it's a metropolis, but Lucknow or Chandigarh or Trichy or Madurai or Bhopal, it is the worst affected city of its size in the whole of India, which is one reflection of poor local self-government. And now that workers are returning, I'm afraid rural Gujarat is in grave danger because the panchayats have not been geared up to deal with this. And that's because panchayats have not been empowered in the way in which the constitution decrees. Now, there are many other states which have not done it in quite the constitutional way, such as Kerala and Karnataka. But those two states have shown that their respective forms of Panchayati Raj can be done. And Gujarat, in those terms, has never been in the forefront of either making any progress or attaining any great height. If Panchayati Raj exists in Gujarat, it is because in 1937, the BG Kher government, the first Congress government of what was then called Bombay, which is a composite of Maharashtra and Gujarat, was given the very first Panchayati Raj Act in India. And they've just carried that forward. So there is a momentum from the past, a Congress momentum from the past that has saved BJP Gujarat, but nothing that the BJP government in Gujarat in the last 2 decades that they've been there can be pointed to as an achievement of the BJP.
Right, sir.
Sir, so you brought up health. Now, primarily, the primary health that is being focused on in India is surrounding the Ayushman Bharat welfare scheme. So, considering that it has gained massive popularity today, how can this be included in the Panchayat Raj system as well? And if it isn't happening, then why is that so?
Well, Ayushman, like Manrega, like the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, like almost any scheme of rural development from the center that you can name, and almost all schemes of state-based rural development or rural welfare that you can name, have all by and large elided the Panchayati Raj system. It's only in Kerala and to a large extent in Karnataka as well that the panchayat system has been leveraged. I think Maharashtra has also done it. Bengal had a long history of doing it. There has been sensible, I think Sikkim is an example I should give, and one or two others that one could name, like Himachal Pradesh, where the panchayat system has been partially leveraged or more effectively leveraged than elsewhere. But nowhere has it been leveraged in terms of the committee report to which Shivang referred a few minutes ago in my expert committee report. So the kind of thoroughgoing empowerment of the panchayats with functions, finances, and functionaries that has been charted in that report, which the government of India under the Congress did not act on, and which the Modi government have completely buried, I would like to thank Shivank for making me feel like Jesus Christ. He has resurrected me from the dead, because that report has now been totally buried ever since it appeared some 12 or 13 years ago.
So, per your understanding, it's primarily the BJP government who has, for lack of a better term, un-Gandhified or uncongressified the governance structures as they exist right now.
You see, the concept that Rajiv Gandhi had required conscientious implementation. There was conscientious conceptualization. But don't forget that in 1989, which was the year that the constitution amendments were introduced, we lost. We didn't win. We lost in the Rajya Sabha. And then there were some modifications made by the VP Singh government that were never brought to parliament. And then Rajiv Gandhi died before the Narasimha Rao government was formed. And so we did not have him even for the finalization of the acts, but he was there with us in spirit. So I do think the acts as amended do reflect the spirit and perhaps 95% or so of the letter of what Rajivji did. But subsequent to that, there was no great belief in Panchayati Raj on the part of the successive prime ministers we had. Narasimha Rao thought his duty was done once he got the acts passed. And that, in a sense, was the historic turning point. But he left the implementation, as is required by the constitution, to the states. And he didn't particularly lean on them. And then we had 3 governments of Vajpayee. And then we had 2 short-lived governments of Devegowda and I.K. Gujral. And when Dr. Manmohan Singh became the prime minister, although he showed that he was interested, I don't think he really gave any leadership to this matter. It was left to me, it was left to the Congress president. And the 2 of us did what we could. But in the absence of thoroughgoing central government commitment to Panchayati Raj, I have to confess that my term of 5 years as the Panchayat Raj minister, the very first minister of Panchayat Raj that India had ever had, was a failure. My joint secretary came to me in my last year and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but you've lost the plot." And I had to confess that I'd lost the plot, because without high-level political backing, you can't get high-level political personalities to have a commitment that the Prime Minister himself or the central government itself doesn't have. The one exception was Kerala, and the other was a man whom I knew and respect very highly, Ghorpade, in a state like Karnataka, which had already had, Abdul Nazir Saab, as the Panchayat minister, and he was really a pioneer in this regard. And of course, West Bengal under the communists had always had an interest in Panchayati Raj, although their larger interest was a communist capture of the Panchayats, which is why after a great beginning, it deteriorated into Gunda Raj. But that's where we stand. And oddly enough, although Tamil Nadu, where you're speaking to me from, in both the Dravidian parties, abstained or voted against the 73rd and 74th amendments, they have done a pretty good job of it, a much better job in some ways than several of the states in northern India, which had, in a token manner, voted for these amendments.
So primarily a lack of a concerted push and certain parties not really engaging with the issue per se. like we move on a bit, something more recent. Following the Uri attacks, India has carried out a policy of isolation against Pakistan in Southeast Asia. How important was this policy of isolation in response to terrorism, and what would be the UPA strategy in response to such a terrorist attack as Uri?
I think you're mixing up two very complicated questions. So may I request you to postpone your nuclear question for the moment? Let us deal with how we should react to terrorist attacks. Now, the terrorists who attacked us in Pathankot and Uri together amounted to about 10 people. Their objectives were not civilian targets. They were both military targets. And in both cases, there were serious security lapses that allowed these outsiders to even get to their targets. Don't forget that in the case of Pathankot, it was actually a superintendent of police who gave the terrorists a lift up to Pathankot when they showed they didn't know the way. And then they were able to easily vault the walls. At Uri, the outer wall of the army encampment there actually abuts the Uri Bazaar. So it is accessible. And given the accessibility to those who are determined to get in, with the objective of becoming martyrs there, they're ready to die. The security arrangement was inadequate. The reaction to Pathankot on the part of Nawaz Sharif was to say that he would undertake an investigation. But when we dragged our feet, thinking that the Pakistanis, or believing that the Pakistanis were dragging their feet even more, that attempt at a joint exercise completely collapsed. And at Uri, of course, there was not even an attempt to do so. Instead, we started having surgical strikes. Now, the question that my Pakistani friends ask me is, how can you strike at a launch pad when launch pads are meant for missiles, not for terrorists, alleged or real? So what did we hit in that surgical strike? I don't know. I'm told that it might have been one of these migrant Gurjar huts where the 6 terrorists took some kind, rested for a while, had some water, ate something, probably did their last prayers, and then went in looking for 72 Huris. They were ready to die. And the surgical strike was aimed at A, demonstrating that you can't get away with these things, and B, therefore deterring, overawing the Pakistanis from sending in more terrorists. Yet the number of terrorists who've come into India after the surgical strike is, according to the government's own figures, rather larger than before the surgical strike took place. Now, if anyone like me says this, we are immediately labeled as being anti the Indian army. I have no criticism to make of the Indian army. My question is not directed at the actions of the Indian army. My questions are directed at the government of India. And that in a democracy is the right of every citizen. Now, I'm not an important enough man for Mr. Amit Shah to respond to me, so I'm not expecting a reply. But to the best of my knowledge, and I admit its limitations, there has been no clarification from the government as to what its larger objective was when it undertook the surgical strikes. All we know, and this has been confirmed by government figures, is that the number of terrorists infiltrating into India, particularly in the Kashmir region, has increased rather than decreased. So I don't know whether we have a strategy to deal with these people, but to my mind, the every time we break off talks with Pakistan, we are handing, because of a terrorist attack, we are handing a huge victory to the terrorists whose goal is to sabotage and undermine the ongoing talks. Now, unless we talk to the Pakistanis, as Dr. Manmohan Singh said, there is no, there's no, or there's no way in which we can flesh out the Joint Anti-Terror Mechanism, ATM, that Musharraf and Manmohan Singh agreed upon in their meeting in Havana at the Non-Aligned Summit of, I think, the year 2007. Now, that may be a way forward. In any case, until and unless we are able to demonstrate that we are really sincere in wanting to settle matters with Pakistan, we are leaving no incentive in the hands of the Pakistan government to rein in their terrorists who are killing far more Pakistanis than they are killing Indians. Please remember that. For Pakistan is both the world's terrorism hub as well as the world's biggest victim of terrorism. So they are in a bind, a bit of a bind. And I think it is when the dialogue takes place, when there is real connections between the two, that there is an incentive for the Pakistanis to at least try to rein in their terrorists. Otherwise, like Mr. Modi is now being accused of being soft on the Chinese, the government of Pakistan is accused by Pakistanis, and particularly the dominant Pakistani armed forces, of being soft on India and not being sincere about getting back Kashmir.
So your primary alternative as the UPA would have been discourse and diplomacy.
Yes, in what I have called for the last 25 years, uninterrupted and uninterruptible dialogue. We cannot afford to play a game of snakes and ladders. When Manmohan is in power, we go up the ladder. When Modi comes in, we go down by the snake's mouth, right to the start point. So every time it's not only start and go, it's also start all over again. And how can we make progress if we do not speak continuously to each other? If we can have 18 rounds of discussion on the border with the Chinese, who have actually defeated us in battle and who've grown enormously in economic, military, and political power in the world, why can't we talk to the Pakistanis? Why not 18 rounds or 20 rounds or even 50 rounds with them? Why are we, when we are so strong that we can unleash our 56-inch chest on them on the battlefield, why don't we have the courage to talk to them across the negotiating table? It's this that I have never been able to understand. Fortunately, Rajiv Gandhi did. And if he had become Prime Minister again, he would have carried forward his 1989 initiative. And fortunately also, Dr. Manmohan Singh did a tremendous amount. And although we did not give it that name, it was Musharraf who called it the 4-point program on Kashmir. And that is the thread that we need to pick up. We don't need to attribute it to Musharraf. We never have. It's the Musharraf government that has. But Mr. Kasuri, who's a great friend of mine from my college days at Cambridge, he was at Trinity Hall. He has told me that they are not claiming authorship. And they'd be very happy if the 4-point program was changed into a 14-point program or whatever. That doesn't matter,
Excuse
and
me,
the
sir.
name doesn't matter. But
Yeah.
it has been demonstrated by Dr. Manmohan Singh and General Musharraf that progress, even on Kashmir, is entirely within the bounds of possibility.
Yes.
Sir, so due to the lack of time, we would like to conclude with our last question. So as you spoke about there being certain action which crossed a certain level of threshold. Sir, when there was a terrorist attack in 2008, the 26/11 Mumbai attacks, what were the geopolitical realities at that time which prompted the government to not take an action the way the current government has? And what were the alternatives that the government took at that time?
I don't think it was a geopolitical situation. The only geography involved was a small sailing craft on the Arabian Sea and the absence of any security arrangements outside Bombay to intercept such craft, such naval, not naval, such shipping. Now we've taken all the steps that are required. Maybe all those terrorists should not have been killed, because the one that didn't get killed, Ajmal Kasab, he became our prisoner, and we were able to obtain a fair amount of information with him before we hanged him. And thereafter, there has been no civilian target targeted by the terrorists from Pakistan. They've been concentrating on military targets and on Kashmir. That's where the problem is. So the problem of Pakistani terrorism is in many ways linked to the problem of Kashmir. And we have aggravated that problem by abrogating Article 370 and 35A. So I'm afraid I have no expectations of the present government. I also have no great expectations of an alternative government. So I'm afraid we're stuck there. And that would bring me to Shivank's second question, but perhaps we can hold that on nuclear weapons, which we can perhaps hold over till the next interview, if there is a next interview.
Of course, sir. Thank you so much for being with us. It was an incredible pleasure to talk to you about such matters, and we hope to be seeing you again very soon.
Thank you very much, and all my best to your fellow students. After all, you are all now honorary citizens of my state. Thank you very much for having got in touch.
Thank you
sir.
so much, sir.